Hello everyone, and in this video I'm going to show you how to do cutting and hollowing. But before I get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about other ways of sculpting. For instance, if I wanted to sculpt this bag here, I would take an entire block of clay and I would kind of form the whole entire bag first, and then I would cut it in half and scoop it out. I would add the straps later, right? Because these are probably going to be coils that I would flatten and then I would later add to the bag. And like I said, I'd want the coils to be attached to the bag so that there's not any risk of it breaking. So that's another way of sculpting your form. If you have a form that has several different parts to it, you'd want to sculpt it out in several different parts. So you'd want to block it off and then sculpt them, and then you'd eventually attach them later. So that's just some different ways of sculpting. So what I'm going to show you next is how to cut your object in half. It's also a really good idea to set your object on top of something soft. Maybe you have an extra pillow that's sitting around. You can wrap that pillow up in a bag and then it'll be soft. So I have one here. So while I'm letting it set up, I would set it on this soft pillow so that it doesn't flatten on one side. And I can even use this while I'm sculpting. Some ways of making this pillow are if you have any packing foam or any packing peanuts or any if you have any of this stuff, packing material, you can put this into a bag and you'll have a nice soft pillow to work on. I don't need that yet, but I do want to have it sitting around so that I can set my piece on top of that while I'm working. I have a clean space and I'm just going to cut this piece directly in half. And like I said before, if you have a piece that has multiple giant parts to it, you'll cut off those different sections and then you'll scoop it off into different parts. Hollow them out and then attach them all together. This one just happens to be pretty simple. I can just cut it directly in half. So I can use my wire tool to cut this in half, relatively straight. So now I have two sides. And just like I showed you before in the last project, you're going to take your needle tool and do about 1/4 of an inch line all the way around. And you are going to use your loop tools to scoop out the middle of your piece. And then all of the clay that comes out of there, you're actually going to keep it and you're going to collect it and you're going to smush it together because we're going to use that to continue sculpting with it. So I'm going to go ahead and start to scoop this out. When you're doing this, you want to take into account where your tool is because you don't want to pierce all the way through your object or all the way through your clay. So I'm going to keep scooping this out and then I will get right back to you. So I've hollowed out both of my shapes and I was experiencing a little bit of problems with my clay. It was a little too soft, so it's definitely highly advisable for you to get the overall shape down, let it set up overnight, and then cut it in half and scoop out the interior of it. Also, you want to keep in mind that you don't want to go any thinner than 1/4 of an inch because you still want to be doing some detail work on the outside. And if you have it any thinner than 1/4 of an inch, what can happen is that you won't be able to do any sorts of carvings on the outside because it'll be too thin. So we're looking at more like 1/2 inch to 1/4 of an inch thickness around the whole entire thing. Any thicker than 1/2 inch and it gets a little bit too big and it might not be able to dry in time and it could explode. So I've got one side done here and I have the other side here, and it is really important to hold your piece in one of your hands and then to scoop it out. So I used my smaller circular loop tool for the smaller parts, and then my big loop tool, I used this large rounded section to scoop out the big parts of it. And every single time I did one scooping of it, I stuck my clay together, and this is how much clay came out of the interior of it. So it's quite a bit of clay. And I definitely don't want to waste this. I added some water to it and I wedged it up so I can actually use this to sculpt with, and I can add clay to the outside of this, the little spikes to the outside of my seashell. So I'm going to go ahead and put this together. I've already slipped and scored one side, and now I'm going to go ahead and slip and score the other side by adding it together. And once you slip and score the other side, once you add them together, you're going to let them set up, because clay needs to set up before you can start doing any detail work on it. Clay can be really finicky in the beginning, so you don't want to go on to advanced stages of your sculpture before clay sets up. Otherwise, it's going to be really despairing and your clay is going to go everywhere and you're not going to be able to control it. So it's really important to take into consideration the setup time clay needs. So I don't want to add any more details to this until after waiting. Okay, so I've added that together, or rather I slipped and scored that, and now I'll go ahead and add this together. So I'll take my two parts, squish them together, and I'm going to work all the way around to get these two parts to stick together. And like I said before, it's a little bit easier to do this if your clay has set up overnight, because my clay is actually moving around a lot in my hands. And rather than setting my clay down on the flat surface, I'm going to set it on top of my bag so that it doesn't distort the bottom of it. So I am just using my fingers and I am pushing that clay together. The one benefit about not waiting the next day is that my clay is super soft, so I'm taking my thumb and I can actually rub that clay together. Sometimes when your clay sets up too much, you have to add that tiny little bit of coil around the whole entire thing, like what you did for the sphere. But my clay is super soft that I don't really have to do that. And I am just taking my fingers and I am closing up that seam mark. Eventually, when I'm finished sculpting this or nearing completion, I will choose an area to poke a hole in it or make an opening in it so that I don't have one giant air bubble. But for now, I want to keep that air bubble because it'll actually hold shape better. Kind of like what you did when you made the spheres. You have the air trapped in the inside, and then it helps hold its shape. Okay, so now I have my overall shape, and yeah, it looks pretty messy. I have fingerprints markings all over it, but the best thing to do is to just let it set up. After it starts to dry, then I can start smoothing it out, and then I can start adding extra parts to it. So when it sets up, I will show you the next phase of the sculpting parts, which is pretty much cutting out little bits and adding them to the side. So I would essentially make little cones, solid cones. And I have a little solid cone here because my seashell has these little spikes to it, right? So I can, I'll look at it to see where the cones are actually laid out, and I will put this to the side here because I'm holding my piece in my hand. And I can see that there's a little cone right there and then a little spike right there. So I'm gonna do the second spike, and I can slip and score this together so I can add it on. But I'm gonna wait until this sets up because this is really soft right now. So that's it for this demonstration, and stay tuned for the next demo. I'll get into more specifics about how to sculpt. When you're covering your pieces up, when you're letting them set up, definitely keep them fully covered. Cover the whole entire thing lightly, and then you can let it set up. And I'll wait until the next day. Actually, it's better to like kind of pull the plastic away from the clay so that there's air inside, and then it will set up for the next day. And because you don't want to leave it fully uncovered because it'll dry too much. So yeah, that's it for this demo.